So now let's take a look at one of Darwin's letters. This letter is a very interesting letter from our selection today, and it gives a little window into the man himself. Letters are kind of like that. They, if you can ever read the letters of some great person, you begin to get a different side, a different view of the person because they're more personal. But Darwin mentions in this letter an argument that has been developed in recent years and is now called by some who use this argument the evolutionary argument against naturalism, sometimes just abbreviated EAAN. He also argues this in his autobiography, which he publishes in 1876. Now, the now widely used argument against philosophical naturalism came from the pen of Darwin himself. So even though he believes in evolution and so forth, the idea of an outright pure philosophical naturalism, atheistic naturalism, creates problems, and even Darwin himself sees this. This is what he says in the letter. He says, quote, "The horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind?" Now, in the autobiography, he asks a very similar question. He says, quote, "Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions?" So, the evolutionary argument against evolution kind of runs like this. If we have evolved from lower life forms that have no reason, no consciousness, no epistemological abilities to know truth, and all those evolutionary processes that led to us today are there to help us to survive, not find the truth, then how is it that I can trust my mind? How do I know that the deliverances of my rational process, deliverances of reason, how do I know that they give me the truth? After all, I have a mechanism that is not evolved to find truth, it's evolved to survive, okay? And so Alvin Plantinga, for example, one of the guys who uses this argument with great depth, will say that, perhaps it would be, very effective for me to survive if I believe that there's a tiger always out to get me. It doesn't matter whether there is a tiger, but if I believe that there's a tiger that's out to get me and to eat me, then I'm going to be much more vigilant, and I'm going to stay alive because I'm going to be far more vigilant about dangers. So, in other words, the truth of a proposition isn't what matters. What matters is, does it work to make you survive? And so, but now here's kind of the rub, and this is where Darwin is going with this. If that's the case, then how do you know that the whole process of evolution is true? How do you know that, in fact, it is the truth? You don't. So in reading this letter, we also see a little bit about the man and his demeanor. Darwin was studiously polite and genteel in his life, even very self-effacing, without putting on airs. I should think that he'd be a fine chap with whom I'd like to have a cup of tea someday. A really nice guy to hang around and talk to. So you can see that demeanor coming out in all of his letters, and especially in this one. Now, another thing we see in this letter is that he rejects teleology, the idea that there's any purpose at all in nature. This is a major point of Darwinism, by the way, and it's one of the reasons why Darwinism is over against creationism. And the idea that, well, if there is a purpose to all of creation, or let's just say there's a purpose to various species evolving through the natural world, then that ultimately means that there has to be a reason for it. That means that there has to be some type of purposer behind it. Okay, so teleology and design theories, intelligent design theories, are just species of the same thing. Okay, so all Darwinisms or variants of Darwinism are against teleology. And such views are nigh taboo today in scientific circles. However, there's another strange thing that he says in this letter. He says he asserts that the universe is not the result of chance. Well, this is just rather ambiguous. Think about it. You know, if something isn't due to chance, what is it due to? It's due to intention. There's some intentionality behind it. But intention is purpose. So it's kind of like he's talking, he's going back and forth on this. He doesn't want teleology, but yet he wants to say that the universe is not just happenstance. There's some intention behind it, some purpose. So Darwin also implies in this letter that some races are superior to others. His theories perpetuated the idea of race and that some races are inferior and some races are superior. Today we would call that racism, right? But Darwin states this superiority thesis, and in his day and age, I mean, we can't be, completely anachronistic here. This is mid-19th century or late 19th century. And you might just say, well, such ideas were very common back then. But he's lending some scientific validity to the idea that one race could be superior to other races. After all, the theory of evolution seems to lend itself to such an idea. But we now know such ideas are passé, and are, people who hold such ideas are persona non grata in our society. But it is noteworthy. Few now really see race as anything other than a social construction, albeit a very powerful one. Next, we need to talk about The Descent of Man. This was published in 1871, 12 years after he published The Origin. And this is a smaller work, but it is also a work that extends his theories out to humanity. So the origin of the species doesn't really say in there, it insinuates very, very lightly, but it does not explicitly say that human beings have evolved through natural selection and that human beings have evolved from a common ancestor. But The Descent of Man does. The Descent of Man explains the full implication of Darwin's theories for humanity. So in there, he has humans descending from primates. This was implicit in The Origin, but explicit in The Descent. So Darwin was not the first to make such claims either. And in fact, some of his colleagues, Huxley and Wallace, and also Lyell, had all made such claims. But in 1868, just 2 or 3 years before he goes to publication with the Descent, Darwin begins to feel like it's time for him to address this concern and to connect his theory to humans. Now, I'm not saying that he just suddenly changed his mind. He believed this all the way back when he wrote The Origins. He just didn't put it in there. He didn't feel like the world was ready for that yet, okay? Moreover, he and his social circles were not ready for it yet. It would have created a lot of rifts and problems. So, in 1868, he feels like it's time to come out and to connect his theory to that. And perhaps the view was, by 1871, somewhat old news, but at any rate, The Descent is not the same caliber as The Origin. The Origin is his true magnum opus. The Descent didn't have the same impact or the same popularity as The Origin did. Perhaps it's because Darwin was getting much older and his powers of observation or his creative ability were beginning to decline. But this work encountered far more opposition, whereas The Origin had been embraced widely in society back then, not universally, but widely. The Descent encountered far more opposition. The Descent sets a stage for something that we call today evolutionary psychology and evolutionary sociology, explaining that humanity's moral development, our social development, our political development, and everything are centered on evolutionary ideas. The idea that we have sympathy and the ability to think for future events and plan for the future are also part of the explanation here. So evolution by natural selection will become the framework for explaining everything now, from culture to diet to religion and so forth and so on. And so, in other words, everything that we do is going to be explained by these by evolution. So now let's turn and talk about the creation versus evolution debate. You can't really avoid this topic. Okay, because Darwin and the Darwinists are constantly bringing this up and constantly explaining it. They're trying to explicitly deal with the issue of creationism and the idea of something called special creation. So they're constantly attacking this idea, trying to refute it, and trying to give a body of evidence that is sufficient to abandon the notion of special creation. And the opposing view, of course, as we've said, is that all species have evolved through natural selection from a common ancestor, okay? All species. So his ideas, Darwin's ideas, intentionally and explicitly deny biblical creation, special creation of species. He holds that this is a dogmatic view, the creationism is, and the idea that all species were created by God. So in a way, this is Darwin versus Moses, or Darwin versus Genesis. But there are some who see a middle way today, well, going all the way back to Darwin's time. Immediately after Darwin's views began to take root and to grow and become very popular, there were many who were creationists who wanted to find a middle way. And so today there are significant movements such as one today called BioLogos. It's led by the former Human Genome Project head Francis Collins, who wrote a work called The Language of God. But these groups try to offer substantial evidences for a kind of revived theistic evolutionary view. Now, theistic evolution is, like I said, an idea that emerged almost immediately after Darwin's views became popular. And the basic claim here is that God creates humanity through the evolutionary process, okay? And so this is seen as kind of like to be a both-and approach, both creation and evolution brought together. Obviously, when you have such an attempt, that doesn't make either of the two camps that are of the purist happy. And both of those camps would say that the third way is a sham in a way. Okay, so such views do satisfy some, but the pure Darwinists typically insist on a kind of pure, full-blown naturalism without any God whatsoever. Now, those who adopted the theistic evolutionary view were of the mindset of deism. You remember we talked about the deistic idea, but there were some people who were still full-blown theists. That is, they believed in the biblical God, not just a providential supreme being. But there's an attempt to try to reconcile these two views, even down to this moment. Okay. So at this moment, there is still an ongoing three-way debate, and it crescendos and appears to be intractable due to underlying philosophical assumptions. Now, one of the things that we need to remember is that from a philosophical point of view, our deepest assumptions cannot be verified by evidences of any sort. That's why they're called an assumption. Now, often we do assume things, and then we go on to try to find evidence to see whether the assumption is correct or not. But at the very deepest parts of our worldview, there are assumptions for which there is no evidence. In fact, it's the other way around. You use those assumptions to organize and understand the evidences that you encounter. So the way you understand the evidence that you see is governed by your assumptions. And so you can't get below those assumptions. You cannot find evidence to support the assumption. No, you use the assumption to interpret the evidence. You may have heard the little saying that brute facts are mute facts. The idea being here that brute facts do not speak for themselves, okay? So the brute facts can't speak. But what makes the facts speak are the assumptions that you hold. And you cannot not have assumptions. Everyone in this debate, no matter where you are, whether you're in the Darwinian camp, the creationist camp, or in the theistic evolutionary camp of the BioLogos folks, everyone should recognize that their worldview assumptions determine their conclusions, determines what they will even consider evidence to be.